How accurate is the Bible? And this is one of 12 basic objections that occurs. And I wrote a book with my friend Larry Moody called I'm Glad You Asked. And when people ask, what's the name of that book? I say, I'm glad you asked. And then it goes around until they finally realize that's the name of the book. But that book came to our minds as a needful resource to empower and equip people who are going to be asked these questions. If you're really sharing your faith, and if people are thinking at all the variations and combinations of the questions I've heard are really adaptations of these 12. And one of the 12 basic objections is, of course, the variations on how accurate is the Bible. And then there are questions within the questions. And my goal is just to give you a brief outline that might perhaps help you along those lines. Again, you'll find a lot of that material in the book, I'm Glad You Asked, as well. So I'm a big believer in helping us to think through issues you know they're going to ask. And it's good for you to really have the ability, and this is what I'd like to see it, turning objections into opportunities. That's what I'm a big believer in doing. If you can take an objection and you actually want to be asked these things, because it gives you an opportunity then to reflect with another person about these issues that really thinking people need to explore together. The heart cannot rejoice in what the mind rejects. And it's needful for us, therefore, to have a clear mind and a warm heart. And melding mind and heart, in my opinion, is absolutely essential. That God wants us to think well. He wants us to love well and to live well. And it's really a matter of knowing and being and doing. It's a matter of the head, the heart and the head and the hands. And putting all these together, it's really a more holistic approach. He wants us then to be a people who are manifestations, incarnations of truth, who are living epistles known and read by all men in such a way that they see a quality about you that indicates, that points to something beyond you. That is to say that you've been with Jesus. Something about you that smacks, that signals, it's a whiff of the transcendent, that cannot be reduced merely to nature and nurture. Something about you that transcends the elemental principles of the world. And this is the thing about us that we want not merely to answer questions, but really to do it in a context where we are loving and winsome in that manner. Before I go into the content itself, I want to add one other introductory comment. I have found over the years that the most effective approach to doing apologetics is asking good questions and listening. And rather than you always being on the defensive, I think the most effective thing you can do is to ask people a question, not in an adversarial way, but really you want to understand, tell me what you think about this issue here. And what do you think is our purpose on being in this world? Or do you have any spiritual beliefs? Or what do you think happens to us in death? Minor little issues like this. But the point is, you let them speak, but you don't correct them. Just let them go on. And then having said that, then you ask them, that's an interesting point. If this is true, help me understand this. And then another question leads to another. And after a while, most people will discover that they haven't really thought out what they thought they believed. And they're going to discover after a few subsidiary questions, again, not in an adversarial way, that they really haven't thought it through. Most people haven't got a well-articulated worldview. It's shallow, and when you press it a little bit, it can really reveal that. So that's one of the advantages of doing this. A second advantage, you learn right where they're coming from. And the third one is that you win your right to be heard by showing a genuine interest in what they are asking. And rather than objecting, you're just helping them and you're teasing that out from them, the real issues. And this can be a very, very helpful thing. I think this is then a way of building a basis for a relationship that's other-centered, and very few people have the experience of others who listen to them effectively. Have you noticed this? Most people aren't listened to well at all. That's why we have to pay people to do it. They're called counselors, psychiatrists, and so forth. They're the only people who may really listen to us well, and even there, we're not always sure. Now, here are some of the often asked objections. These are variations of this question. Isn't the Bible full of contradictions and errors? Maybe one way in which you hear this fundamental question. Or another, maybe the Bible has been copied and translated so many times, hasn't this process led to a multiplicity of errors? Or a third, how can you be sure that the Bible is the same now as when it was written? Another common variation. A fourth variation, didn't the church arbitrarily decide which books should be included and which books should be rejected? And these are all aspects of the same fundamental question, is the Bible reliable? Remember now, you don't have to write this down. It's on the slide, so I'm just giving you help here. Trying to make life easy for you. Some more of the variations that I've heard of the same question. So many people have different interpretations of the Bible. What makes you think that yours is correct? Another aspect of it. Or, how can you place your faith in a book that condones genocide and slavery? I'm sure many of us in this room have heard most of these kinds of questions, or many of these questions. Doesn't the Bible make a number of claims that are scientifically inaccurate? And finally, well, that's the last one I've got, sorry. There are many others you could come up with, but those are, you're going to see, though, that those are really all variations of this one question. Have you ever had, by the way, this is parenthetical, an experience where a person hits you with that and then throws in the problem of evil and then throws in the problem of the hypocrites and they're trying to overwhelm you? Have you ever had that? The way you approach that is very simple. Divide and conquer. Here's what I hear you asking. This, and this. Let's focus on this one first. You see what you're doing? Because if you really have thought through, you can pretty well pick out, oh, he's asking number 3, 7, and 9. Because every objection I've heard is a variation and combination of one of these 12, essentially. Obviously, within each one, there are many layers. And no one, may I assure you, has all the answers to these objections. And this is why I should also mention, I'm going to give you some perspectives, not all the answers. It would be impossible for me to give you exhaustive answers to all these questions, but there are resources that are available that can help you. And here's the important thing whenever you're sharing your faith with another person. Be sure that you, when the person asks you a question you don't know the answer to, admit that. Say, that's an excellent question. Let me think about that. And let's get back and I'll see what I can come up with. What you're doing is you're honoring their question, showing them that they're thinking well. Secondly, you're giving yourself a chance to look up the answer. And third, you're giving yourself a chance to then get back together with them and discuss it, you see? So you have nothing to fear. You don't need to have all the answers. Now, when you are hit with a question and you don't have an answer, the first time you're not responsible, the second time you are. You see, the first time, it's understandable. But if you're asked the same question a second time very specifically and you still haven't got an answer, you have some accountability. This is how you learn. You learn a skill by practice and by endeavor and by doing. Is this correct? And we must be willing to also fail. And ultimately, that's part of the development of a skill as well. So my goal here is modest. It's just going to give you an outline of the fundamental issues that I have heard and the objections that I've heard raised over the years. And then from there, we will explore. We're going to have some time for interaction as well. So let me look at the 3 basic options that there are for this question. The first one is simply a sweeping rejection of the reliability of the Bible. It just is this notion that almost always fostered by exposure to negative teaching about the Bible, rather than usually first-hand investigation of its contents. This has been my experience. It's usually some kind of thinking, something they've read or something of that along those lines. And that's a more specific problem-oriented approach that questions the veracity of the Bible because of some specific trouble spots. And these would include such objections or concerns as the problem of inspiration or interpretation. What about all these interpretations that people have? Or something more along the lines of science in the Bible, or ethics, or apparent errors that appear in the text, or the problem of canonicity, which books should be included, or finally the question of miracles. Those are questions, again, that are sub-questions, and it's a second component. It may be that the Bible is reliable, but I have this barrier. Help me think that one through. And then the third, of course, would be full acceptance of the authority of Scripture. And so, with this in view, this is where we're going to be heading. We're going to be looking tonight at this first option then, that challenges the trustworthiness of the Bible. And then tomorrow we're going to be looking at the second and third options, that there are problems with the Bible, and that it is, the final conclusion is, what are the implications if it really is trustworthy? As you know, revelation demands a response. If it really is a revealed word from the one from whom and through whom and to whom all things come, then we do well to listen to it, not just with our ears, but with our hands and with application. We have to have ears to hear and do hear, and hearing is found in application. It requires a response. And thus God's far more concerned about our transformation than merely our information. Information's important, but propositional truth in Scripture must always point beyond itself to personal truth. You see the concept, that it's not just propositions about God, but ultimately His desire is that we have a response whereby we come to know this being. And that, I think, is extraordinarily important for us to keep in mind. So with this in mind, let's explore this first option, that the claim is the Bible isn't trustworthy, and one of the bases for this objection is what I would call false impressions that people have. It's usually the impressions that people get from sources other than the Bible, something they've read, something they heard in a college course, perhaps. And I find that most people's knowledge of the Bible is really gained from second, third, and even fourth-hand sources. This is why some people really believe that the Bible says God helps those who help themselves. It doesn't teach that, although I once thought it did. My father used to get me on this one. Cleanliness is next to godliness. You see, when he wanted me to take a bath, he'd throw this in. And I later found out that that came from second opinions. And the first one was from first hesitations. You see, so these are things that aren't in the Bible. It's more like Little Richard's Almanac is what you're dealing with here. You're dealing with good common advice, but most folks are abysmally ignorant. And if you have done or read about surveys about Bible knowledge, you wouldn't believe what people think. Most people can't even name the 4 Gospels. It's absolutely fascinating. And if you ever saw jaywalking, some of Jay Leno's videos about this, it'd be fun if he just did a subdivision of that just on Bible knowledge. It'd be very amusing indeed. It's funny and sad at the same time. It's needful. The better we know the Scriptures, the more grounded we are in truth, the more we are empowered to become the people God always intended us to be. And that's His great and deep and profound desire for us. It's not just a head trip. Another false impression that people have is folks think that the Bible teaches that the earth is flat. It does not. Or that it teaches that the earth is the center of the universe. It never taught this. And what we have here is just a common misperception. Or that the New Testament, well, it was written centuries after the events it describes. This is, again, a false impression that people pick up from varying sources, and they just assume that these are true. Or that the earliest New Testament manuscripts are really from the 4th and 5th centuries, again, hundreds of years later. Or that the English Bible is a translation of a translation, you see, and therefore it must be full of errors. And this sort of notion then that we can have, that it's just that fresh errors were introduced in each stage of the process. Yet more false impressions that people pick up. Particularly in college courses. I don't know, I think that there are some profs who just, when they get a new batch of freshmen, they take it upon themselves as their particular imperative that they disabuse these benighted freshmen of these theological beliefs that they have so that they can enlighten them into the ways of truth. And so there's a certain pleasure in doing so. One of those things that typically we'll hear is that the Old Testament is merely a derivative of earlier Babylonian and Assyrian myths. And this is a common kind of a view. And law codes. And that is, as upon further examination, not the case. I'll mention that a little bit later. Or a common view that the Bible is filled with contradictions. But what I find is that very few, when you ask, can you give me some examples, can give you examples. Now, there are a few, and sometimes they might remember that they heard in some course that there were two contradictory creation accounts, one in Genesis 1 and the other in Genesis 2. And the exegesis that drives this is very shallow indeed. But at any rate, this is the sort of thing that people pick up somewhere along the line, so they think it's contradictory. I may have time to explore that with you, but that is certainly not the case. What I've discovered is that very few people who raise these kinds of objections have personally examined the Bible for those alleged contradictions. I find that it's generally not the case. And so if a person has one in mind, very well. Let's ask about that, find out what it is, and then explore that together. And if it's a particular thing that you hadn't heard before, say again, what should you say? That's a good objection. That's a good question. Let me see what I can find out about it. And that's how you learn. By practice, by endeavor. There's nothing to fear about not knowing the answers. It's just a question then of discovering the answers at the point of need, and I promise you'll be incentivized to do that. Because then you'll remember that, and after a while, you begin to develop, I think, more of a skill set along these lines. There's something of a failure to, by the way, when you think of contradictions, a statement that is or of logic that is necessarily false, saying that A equals A and non-A in the same time and in the same sense would be a problem indeed. You would have a very clear contradiction. If I said, for example, we are now in Atlanta, which is where I live. We're also in Washington. Well, if I mean that in the same sense and in the same way, you can't have it both ways. And people might say, oh, that's just Western logic. Nobody who even articulates a sentence, and this includes the East, can make a statement that doesn't, in fact, presuppose the law of non-contradiction. You can't make a statement or an affirmation without presupposing. But that's another issue. We're not talking about contradictions, where I'm going to be claiming that we're not dealing so much with contradictions. There's a paradoxical notion. For example, something that seems a little bit mysterious, we can't sort it out. As C.S. Lewis wrote to his godchild, Lucy Barfield, to whom he dedicated The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Here's a little note he wrote to her. Someday you will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. And you see, it's not a contradiction, it's a paradox, you see, because really you had to be old enough to be able to really grasp them. And that's a very important insight, that sort of thing. Mary Shelley said, "The silence of midnight, to speak truly, though apparently a paradox, rung in my ears." So you have that sort of a thing. Jesus, the first shall be last. He did a lot of things along these lines. They're not contradictory statements, but you explore them, and there's a dimension of mystery. Here's an article from the New York Times in December of 2006. India prosperity creates paradox. Many children are fat, even more are famished. Well, it's a very strange notion but that's the sort of thing that happens. There's a mystery, though, and a mystery is another thing. It's something that's just cannot be accounted for. We cannot explain what a mystery might be. And there are numerous mysteries in Scripture. First book I ever wrote was a book called God I Don't Understand, and I dealt with 10 basic mysteries in Scripture. And a mystery is something such as the fact that God is sovereign over all things, and yet we have human responsibility, or the mystery of the divine Trinity, or the mystery of the God-man, and others, God's relationship to time, to space, immanence versus transcendence, omnipresence versus localization. These are mysteries in Scripture. And so that was the first book I wrote. Unfortunately, if you read the spine, it says, God I Don't Understand, Boa. You see, that was the problem with that book when it came out. And it's just been reissued. I don't know if I brought some books, but most of them are not here. That's a paradox. Because they've all been given away. But so I didn't really have a chance to bring many articles, but you can find that stuff on the website if you're interested in it. By the way, my second book was also bad. It was called Cults, World Religions, and You. That was the original title. And I didn't like that because the spine said, Cults, World Religions, and You, Boa. You see, so they changed that later to cults, world religions, and the occult, and that's better. But I believe, by the way, and this is parenthetical, that the idea of certain things in Scripture transcending the ceiling of our own comprehension actually is an evidence of its divine authorship. Why? Because it's something nobody would have or could have made up. It's utterly unique in its teachings and its propositions, and that's a whole presentation in itself. I have a list of 30 uniquenesses of Christianity, of the whole Christian faith, and there are numerous ones. So that would be an indication. By the way, though, don't be surprised. Life is full of mystery. The more we learn about the material universe, the more mysterious it becomes when you stop and think about all the mysteries. We don't even know what energy is. We can't define time, and so forth. There are numerous mysteries. No one really knows exactly what life is. It cannot be reduced to the component parts, but suddenly this thing that transcends the component parts of physics and chemistry suddenly comes into being, and it has qualities that are not reducible to those. Life's full of mystery if we stop and think about it. We know, in fact, the more we're learning, the less we realize we know. In fact, the mark of the best academics that I know is that they know enough to know how little they know. You see, when you first get out of graduate school, you know everything, you see, and you'll know more than you'll ever know again. But when you get a little bit of humility and realization that you don't know anything, the older we get, the more we should be aware of how little we know. And I think that's a healthy thing. I call that epistemic humility. Epistemic humility, which means that, which is the idea of knowledge, epistemology. Have a little humility. Our knowledge is mighty limited. Let's just admit that. Frankly, I don't even know another person. Other people are mysteries. If you're married to a mystery. And yet your ambition is to try to change that mystery, which is the dumbest thing you can try to do. You can't even change yourself, and you're systematically mysterious. There's this semi-transcendent I. What is this thing that I call the I? It actually has a semi-transcendent quality. So life is full of this sort of a thing, but that's not the point. I don't believe the Bible. I don't believe the Bible. It's just a flat-out statement that sometimes people will say. Now, when I hear that question, I would immediately ask the simple question, do you understand the message of the Bible? That's a good question. If someone just flat out says, I just don't believe it. One good question then is to say, do you understand what the message is? Because after you graciously point this out, most people will present a very distorted picture. Am I correct? For example, someone says, are you religious? Don't answer that question. Ask, what do you mean by religion? And you can be sure that whatever they say, you're not it. You see, all these distortions. So let them tease that out. This is just something we learn to do, is ask good questions. Jesus was a master, was he not, of asking questions and answering questions with questions and so forth, to help people, again, go through the process of self-discovery and gaining insight, forcing them to reveal to themselves things that they did not know, in that sense of how little we know. And so if they give us a distorted message, I would tell them more or less along these lines, but graciously. I'm not trying to be cynical or nasty, but I think you owe it to yourself to have a correct picture of the basic message of the Bible before you decide to accept it or reject it, which I think makes a lot of sense. And it's simply a matter of doing that. And by the way, I appeal to people's intellectual integrity here. What I'm actually appealing to is that they make an informed decision about this Jesus, whether they accept him or reject him. Because to ignore him is tantamount to rejecting him, if indeed he claimed to be the one who gave his life on our behalf. So the position of total neutrality is not really an option, because it's actually a choice to say no. So we're in this very uncomfortable position where we can make a choice one way or the other. Let's at least make it an informed decision. And I'll appeal even to intellectual pride. You owe it to yourself to at least read one of the gospel accounts, read it firsthand, and then decide what you're going to do with this person. But since he's shaped human history in such a unique and profound way, you owe it to yourself to hear one of the first-hand accounts rather than getting it second-hand. And by the way, if I can get them to read one of the Gospels, I have them right where I want them, you see, because then the power of the Spirit of God can be released in them as they read the Scriptures. And if I can get them to read, say, the Gospel of John, that's where you want them to be. And so whatever it takes, if it appeals to, if it's to the intellectual pride, so be it. At any rate, when I speak about the idea, if a person has an honest objection to the Bible, or being vague, or if it's being vague or uses a smokescreen, that's a different matter. But if he has a specific objection, then we want to give direct answers. When I think about the whole idea of the Bible, I think of three basic tests for its reliability. What's called the bibliographic test, the internal test, and the external test. And I want to explore those with you this evening. So the bibliographic test concerns this matter of reliability, and this examines effectively the transmission of the text from the original autographs, which is the original manuscripts, none of which we possess, to the present day. How were they transmitted? How were they disseminated? And so forth. And the three aspects of this particular test then are, in fact, the quantity of the manuscripts that we have, both in the Older and the New Testament, as well as the quality, and then finally, the time span. And so I think it's very helpful for us to explore these as we work through these. And as I start with looking at these, I want to hone in first of all on the test of quantity, and looking at the Old Testament first. The idea of the quantity of the manuscripts in the case of the Old Testament is modest. There's a modest quantity. Not a ridiculously small, but the reality is that the Jewish scribes, it turns out, ceremonially buried imperfect and worn manuscripts, because if it was getting hard to read and so forth, they did not want the text to be distorted. And so this was commonly done. Also, many manuscripts were clearly lost and destroyed during the turbulent history of Israel. You can imagine all that implied. Another interesting thing is that the Old Testament text was later standardized by the Masoretic Jewish community in the 6th century AD, and that all attempts that deviated from the Masoretic text were evidently eliminated, because what we have then is that particular text tradition. And so we have then not as large a quantity as we might like. It's more modest, but not unreasonably small. But I'll make another comment about that, because when we look at the Old Testament, there are other things besides just the Hebrew text. The existing Hebrew manuscripts turn out to be supplemented by, for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I'll say a word about that in a moment, by the Septuagint, which is a 3rd century BC Greek translation of the Old Testament. They're also supplemented by the Samaritan Pentateuch, and also by the Targums. The Targums are ancient paraphrases of the Old Testament. And finally, by the Talmud itself, which has teachings and commentaries that are related to the Hebrew scriptures. So we have these other external components that supplement our knowledge of the actual manuscripts themselves. Now, as to the New Testament, when we think about the quantity, that's extraordinary, because it's unprecedented and unparalleled in ancient literature. There's nothing like it in the ancient world. The existing manuscripts that we have, well over, actually this is out of date now, there's far more than 5,000 Greek manuscripts that we now possess, and also more than 8,000, probably more like 9 or more Latin manuscripts, as well as a growing number of manuscripts of the New Testament in other languages. And so in addition to this, we should also be aware that there are literally tens of thousands of New Testament passage citations given by the early church fathers. In fact, if you did not have a manuscript of the New Testament, you could actually recover almost all of it just by the quotations by Irenaeus and by Clement, Ignatius, and so forth. You could actually recover almost the entire text is quoted, and we have this certainly by the beginning of the 4th century. So you have tens of thousands of direct quotations of that. So that's an extra component that we have. And indeed, when we think about, by comparison with the classical world, the Greek and Latin classics, what you have is a typical number of copies for manuscripts, let's say by Plato or Aristotle or Caesar or Tacitus of a particular work, would range from 1 to typically about 20 at the max. Typically, there are some exceptions, but it's very different. So we have a lot of manuscripts here. I don't know, my friend threw this in. Here's Sandy right here. This is a Greek man. You know, this is an amazing find that they discovered here. Sorry about that. Just seeing if you're with me. As to the reliability of the quality of the issue, if we start with the issue of going from quantity to quality, and for that, we have extreme care exercised by the Jewish scribes that have led to a very, very high quality because of the great reverence that they had toward the scriptures. They were very careful. The entire scribal process was in fact handled and specified in meticulous detail to minimize the possibility of even the slightest error. They would count the number of letters, the number of words, and the number of lines. They would even determine the middle letters of the Pentateuch and the Old Testament. And in some cases, if an error were found, the manuscript would be destroyed. Think about having 1 year of your life destroyed in that way. You will be very incentivized to make it right. And this is why they would look at a word and write it, and then they'd go back and get the next word and be very, very meticulous. Everything was done in a particular way. This led to an unprecedented degree of precision in terms of the manuscript transmission in the Old Testament. And so if you don't want that manuscript to be destroyed, you want to be careful. And as a result of this, then, it surpasses, in terms of the quality, other ancient manuscripts by a great degree. I mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls earlier, and this supplements our understanding because the discovery in 1947 near the Dead Sea in the Masoretic community, not the Masoretic, but the Qumran, typically regarded as Essenes, but in that Qumran community, in the caves near that, as you know, these were discovered, and they date back to a period of time that antedates our earliest Masoretic text by about 1,000 years. And the fact is then that in spite of this time span, it's significant that the number of variant readings is very small. If you compare the Isaiah scroll, for example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you compare that with the later Masoretic text, the errors are exceedingly small. Spelling errors, a few stylistic sorts of things, but nothing that in any meaningful way impedes the narrative, the actual meaning of the text. And this is, we're talking about here, of over 1,000 years of separation in time. So it really underscored what we already intuitively knew. It was just an extra support of that position. Now, as to going now to the New Testament in terms of its reliability, the Old Testament is excellent, the New Testament is quite good. Again, I think, apart from the Old Testament, better than other manuscripts in terms of its quality than we possess from the ancient Latin and Greek classics. And so it's, I think, very high. Again, thousands of manuscripts, and thus there are many textual variants. And I think this is important for us to see. Many variant readings, but these variant readings are actually used by scholars to reconstruct the original meaning by determining which variant reading best explains the others in a given text. Now, Bart Ehrman has written a number of books, one called Misquoting Jesus, where he makes a big thing about textual criticism. His text is effectively had nothing new. I took a course in textual criticism, and really Ehrman's book has no new thing that my textual criticism did not already carefully deal with. But for some reason, he decided that certain issues had huge implications. But the best that you can come up with are effectively three. And these are the biggest you got. And none of these three affect even the slightest doctrine or application. It's the story in John 8 of the woman caught in adultery, almost certainly not in the original text. And so it was added to it. The second one is the long ending of the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark, in chapter 16, verses 9 and following. That has a little bit better support, but probably not really very accurate or reliable text to work with. And the third one was something that was added a good deal later in the King James from 1 John chapter 5 about a Trinitarian formula. That's it. That's about as bad as it gets. Those are the best examples. And when he describes them, he acts, oh my word, you see, the whole thing is filled with errors. Not exactly. This is no surprise, you see. So really, when you look at the material itself, I find that, if anything, the support for this is such that the more variant readings we've got, the more it gives us the power to reconstruct the probable meaning of the original. And if any of you have a critical text of the New Testament, you'll see in the bottom the apparatus that actually takes variant readings that may have any meaning or significance, like the difference between hemes and humes, and so the whole idea of we versus you. And what that'll do is it'll actually give you an assessment from A to D as to its likelihood, and there are reasons why, and we can even determine which family, which text types it's in, how many families are represented, which manuscripts, and so forth. And it's actually a fairly precise vehicle that we can use to compare text against text. So if anything, frankly, my study of this gave me even a greater confidence in its reliability. But I think what can often happen is that anti-supernatural biases can sometimes invade us and therefore cause us to make, in my view, some really unwarranted claims based upon evidence that's not really there. Yes, there are variant readings, but again, they're of a tiny nature and such that really they are caused, we know, by auditory errors, faulty writing, faulty memory, and judgment. They had scriptoria, and they would one person would read from the lectionary, from the text itself rather, and he would read the text, and the scribes would be writing it down. And so sometimes there could be errors in hearing, or sometimes ditography could happen. You ever do this where you write at the end of the line, you type in the, and then there's another the right after it? Ever do this, or am I the only one? You know, you put the same word twice. Now it'll immediately be underlined in red. I mean, all this has changed. The rules have changed, you see, before. But at any rate, that's called ditography, common error. And there are various examples of this sort of a thing. And so I could come up with examples of that, and it's often very easy to determine which reading best accounts for the others. Last thought on this. Small number, then, as I say, affect the sense of the passage, and really we're only dealing with a tiny percentage of that. And again, none of these really affect the actual meaning or theology of the New Testament at all. We'll stop here and pick up with the bibliographic test in terms of time span after our break. And then we're going to have some questions later, or we're going to do it tomorrow, Tom? Later this evening. Okay, we're going to pick up where we left off, and we're going to go to 9:15, and then we're going to have a little Q&A time. So a little interaction, so be thinking about what specific questions you might have. We can explore together and think those things through. Obviously, as I say, I'm only scratching the surface of a huge issue, and there are obviously a lot more nuanced components to this, but I'm giving you a broad brush perspective that I have found to be very useful in most of the encounters I have had. The third of the aspects of what I call the bibliographic test, the first was the manuscript quantity, the second was the quality, and the third is now the time span. For those of you who came in a little bit late, at the very beginning, I announced that all of these slides are on my website, kenboa.org, and therefore you do not need to copy these slides at all. You see, they're just, if you just go to resource, the resource box there, in the resource library, you'll see a thing called keynote presentations, and you can get them there. So I'm just trying to make life easier for you. The time span is vis-a-vis the Old Testament concerns, by this I mean the date of the original authorship relative to our first copy of a manuscript of that. That's the number of years from one to the other. And when we look at the Masoretic text of the Old Testament, our earliest real copy of that is in the 9th century. So you're dealing here with a long time after the original materials were written, since the book of Malachi would have been written approximately 400, 425 BC. We're dealing with a long time range there, time span. However, the Dead Sea Scrolls have had a profound impact on this. I alluded to this earlier. They date from 200 BC to 68. And what they do is they push back the time span by over 1,000 years, effectively, you see. And so they bring us closer in that material to the original than we ever had before. So that's really helped a great deal. And this is a very, as you know, very recent discovery. So that's certainly helped the issue of time span for the Old Testament. As for the New Testament, we have a number of resources. It's exceptional, the time span. There's nothing like it. Manuscripts written on papyrus from the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. For example, the John Rylands fragment, P52, has been dated from the Gospel of John from either approximately 117 to 138 AD. This is only within a matter of just a few decades after he would have written his Gospel. Very few decades. And that's really very extraordinary. The Bodmer Papyri dates from about 175 to 225, and then there's another, the Chester Beatty Papyri, dated from about 250. And the time span for these manuscripts are such that they push us back to within a very short interval in terms of when the autograph was written and our earliest known copy of that manuscript. I might also mention that for the most of the New Testament, the time span consists of approximately 200 years or less, and some books within 100 years of the date of authorship. And that, again, can be sharply contrasted with the average time span of over 1,000 years of other ancient Greek and Latin writings. So it's a very, very different picture. And I'll show you a little chart that is often used along those lines. So when I kind of put this together as far as the bibliographic test is concerned, as I see it, the Old and New Testaments enjoy far greater manuscript attestation in terms of quantity, quality, and time span than any other ancient document. I'm going to be making some conclusions from that a little bit later. This is a chart that has been adapted from various books, but F.F. Bruce has written books on the actual transmission of the text, and others have written on this. When we think about contrast with, for example, Homer, we have more copies of Homer's work than any other ancient material. Herodotus, about a 1,350 year time span. And we're dealing with Plato, about 1,300 years, from about 380 BC to about our earliest manuscript is about 900 AD. So there's a large, and the number of quantities, as you can see, is rather small. For Aristotle's works, any one of them, about 1,400 year time span gap, and a very few number of manuscripts. The same is true of Caesar's Gallic Wars, and also of Tacitus' work as well. Typical time span of about 1,000+ years is what we see in classic Greek, Latin literature. And generally speaking, the number of manuscripts is rather small, in fact, very small. And then when we contrast this with the New Testament, the contrast becomes very evident, because suddenly we're now looking at a time span of about 100 years, actually it's probably over 20,000 manuscripts now, and a high degree of reliability relative to these other works. And so I think this is a very important thing. I will make a statement later on, but I'll say it right now, that there's a double standard going on. And the double standard is this, that people who would be more than willing to embrace the work of Plato and Aristotle without any real questioning about its reliability would balk at the New Testament. And it's quite ironic, because you see, if the standard is so rigorous that you question the reliability of the New Testament documents, bearing in mind that it was not written as a New Testament, but rather these are individual primary documents that were then collected. But if you bear this in mind, what you'd have to do, if you are of that cynical an ilk that you would deny the reliability of the New Testament as primary historical documents based upon these considerations, you would long since have had to abandon your knowledge of the ancient world in terms of any writings that would have come, because they were far inferior in terms of these three components. So I think this is a very illuminating thing that most people do not see. A quick word about the internal issue. We've talked now about the bibliographic, then there's the internal test. That is to say, what does the Bible claiming for itself? And this may appear to be circular reasoning. It sounds like we're using the testimony of the Bible to prove that the Bible is true. But what we're really doing, though, is examining the truth claims of the various authors of the Bible. And then we're allowing them to speak for themselves. Are these 40-plus authors of these books, written over a time span, are they consistent in their claims? What does it say about, what do they say? Do they claim to be by eyewitnesses and so forth? And so this is something that I believe is important. And so when we weave this together and look at the other evidences, I think it becomes an important issue of what it claims for itself. For example, John makes this claim: he who has seen has borne witness, and his witness is true, and he knows that he's telling the truth, so that you also may believe. Or 1 John 1:1-3, what was from the beginning, what we have seen with our eyes, what we beheld in our hands handled concerning the word of life, and what we have seen and heard we proclaim to you also. This is not a second-hand account that he's referring to. And Peter, when he said that we didn't follow cleverly devised tales when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. We were eyewitnesses of his majesty. So there are these clear claims to having genuine authority and people who actually palpably saw the resurrected Christ and so forth, which was actually a component of being an apostle, having seen the resurrected Lord, having been with him, that sort of a thing. So this is very, very important for us, at least to take that into account, the whole idea of the internal test. As for the New Testament then, there were independent eyewitness accounts of the New Testament on the life, death, and resurrection, which were written by people who were acquainted with him. And these, again, are independent insofar as you can see there's no real evidence of collusion insofar as there are variations in their ways of giving an account for these materials, as one would expect if you have different witnesses of the same, for example, event that takes place from 4 different perspectives. You're going to get some variation, but the basic kernel should be consistent. These authors maintained their testimony, we know, through persecution and martyrdom. And it's very important for us to see as well that if anyone was in a position to know that what they were saying was not true, they would have known. And people may give their lives for something that they believe is true, but they will not willingly give their lives for something that they believe is false. And if anyone was in a position to know it was false, these writers, these people would have been those people. Had they simply denied that Jesus was Lord, had they simply said that we can just deny the resurrected Christ and believe in these other gods and so forth, they would have been able to avert martyrdom. And so we have this very important psychological component as well. The evidence runs contrary to certain critical claims of distortion that the church is the one that invented it and later on kind of put these words into the disciples' mouths and that sort of approach. I'll comment more about that a little bit later. Not enough time for myths also about Christ to be propagated given the time constraints we've just been discussing. And so these are important components relating to the internal test. They were alive when the New Testament was circulated, and there were people who were around then that could easily have, in fact, rejected that material if it was in error. Remember what Paul says. There are some 500 people who actually saw the resurrected Christ, and effectively most of them are still alive. And so there's an invitation to realize that this is something, again, not done in a corner, but something very real. But we move to another, after the bibliographic and after the internal test, you have the external test. And the external test concerns the whole matter of historicity. And because the scriptures do speak of specific historical events, the question is, to what degree are they verifiably externally? And I think this is a very important issue. We're not dealing with the motif long ago and far away. you see, in the idea that it was like an imaginary motif, but rather they're really locked into space and time and history. And I think this is one of the important things. I'll give you one example, the prologue to Jeremiah. Note the chronological details. The words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, of the priests who were in Anatoth in the land of Benjamin, to whom the word of the Lord came in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. It came also in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, until the end of the 11th year of Zedekiah, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, until the exile of Jerusalem in the 5th month. And we know when those people reigned. We know very much so. I'll give you another example. Luke chapter 3, 1-2. If you study that, he gives a number of locked references and tells us precisely when this occurred. Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 2, if you read that, you can actually determine the date of Ezekiel's first vision to God, of God. It was July 31st of 592 BC. And we can actually date that. With Babylonian chronology has given us records that can connect, and we know when these kings reigned, and so they're locked into the regency of various people who ruled, and we know when they reigned and what year. If it was this year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, we know when that would have been, and so forth. So there is a tremendous clarity of references to historical details. And indeed, there are secular references as well specific to the New Testament. The historicity of Jesus is well established by early Roman and Greek and Jewish sources. And so there are extra biblical writings that affirm many of the major details, such as Flavius Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews, who in fact refers to John the Baptist, he refers to Jesus Christ, he refers to James in that book. And in this work, he also gives us a lot of background details about the Herods, about the Sadducees and the Pharisees, about the high priests like Annas and Caiaphas, and the Roman emperors who are mentioned in the Gospels and Acts. So we have an extra biblical resource. We find other secular references to Jesus, for example, in a letter written a little after 73 by an imprisoned Syrian named Mara bar Serapion, in which he compares the deaths of Socrates, Pythagoras, and Christ. And so it's very interesting that. And other 1st and 2nd century writers include the Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus in his Annals, and also in Suetonius in the lives of the Caesars and in the life of Claudius, and also the Roman governor Pliny the Younger in his epistles, and the Greek satirist Lucian on the death of Peregrine. And Jesus is mentioned as well in the Jewish Talmud on a number of occasions. So it's not as though we don't have other sources, that even if we didn't have the New Testament, we'd know that there was this historical figure who appeared in the scene of history. And so the kinds of acidic doubt that appears where we question whether he was really a historical figure, I think is unwarranted because of not only the reliability of the New Testament as just seen as first-hand or as primary historical documents, but by the extra materials that are also available. Another component of this matter is not just secular references, but archaeological confirmation. I'm not saying that archaeology proves the Bible, but I do think that as we grow in our understanding of the ancient world and gain more information, we begin to see more and more support for the actual reliability. One study Bible, I have a lot of Bibles on my shelves, and one of them is called the Archaeological Study Bible. And it's a fabulous, it's really a good one if you're interested in archaeology, and it really connects archaeological discoveries with specific things that we see. I just want to pull out just a few examples of this. Both the Old and New Testament certainly make abundant references to nations and kings and battles and to cities, to specific mountains, rivers, buildings, treaties, customs, economics, politics, dates, all kinds of things that are specifically alluded to. And I think this is very important for us to see then that many of these details are thereby open to archaeological investigation. And it's important for us as well to see that the kind of higher criticism in the schools of Julius Wellhausen and the documentary hypothesis and some of these things in the 19th century were actually prior to the archaeological explosion that occurred at the end of the 19th century and has continued to the present day, which were based upon certain assumptions that have actually proven to be unwarranted. And so the interesting thing is some of these ideas are still being taught in various seminaries and schools, even though those earlier theories have not really been supported by the evidence. For example, talking about just a few of the books, for the book of Genesis, it's interesting that the excavations in Nuzi, and also the Nuzi tablets, the Mari tablets and letters, as well as the Ebla tablets, which were discovered more recently in 1964, and other tablets found at Alalak. These are tablets that have really been very fascinating because they reveal all sorts of things about the Old Testament that are supported. For example, in the Nuzi tablets, we're dealing with the custom of having your eldest servant inherit your wealth, having a servant heir if you were childless. And it illuminates things that we see in the book of Genesis and from that general period of time. The custom of birthright sales, which is also specifically mentioned, as we know, which occurred with Esau and Jacob. The custom of household idols is also specifically mentioned in these tablets. In other words, it fits the actual period that it's claiming to describe. The Mari tablets, the same sort of thing occurs here, where we have mentions of other things like Nahor, which is apparently a city named after Nahor, identified in Genesis 11, a reference to the Habiru people, most likely an Akkadian reference to the Hebrews and so forth, and the Ebla tablets as well, which refer to various components like the various cities of the plain that were destroyed in Genesis, and so forth. So we have a lot of details. Sodom and Gomorrah and other things are mentioned in these tablets. And so that's very helpful. We go to Jeroboam's reign and Solomon's reign. There are a number of things that tell Megiddo that certainly support those, and many, many other sources. We go a little bit later to the period of Omri and Jehu and Hezekiah. And it provides helpful information about this period that's called the divided kingdom. For example, the Moabite stone, which you can find at the Louvre, is a very interesting stone which yields information about the reign of Omri, who's the 6th king of Israel. He's specifically mentioned there in the Moabite stone. Any of you see this in the Louvre? It's fun to see. You have to make sure you go out of your way to see it. The other thing is the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, and I have seen that as well in the British Museum. Neat to see these things, because there's something about, although I've seen pictures of them, then to see the real thing is somehow, there's almost like a little bit of an epiphany where you see this thing's palpable, it's tangible. I'll never forget, for example, this is parenthetical, when I went to the mummy room in the Cairo Museum, and there you could look right in the face of these mummies, who were, in fact, the pharaohs of the Exodus and the pharaoh of the oppression, and you could look them right in the face. One of them has crow's feet. I mean, you can see their face, and my word, what an eerie experience it was to realize I'm looking right in the face of one to whom Moses said, "Let my people go." Really interesting stuff. And so what we have is a specificity that's connected. We also have the Sennacherib prison, which is at the Oriental Institute in Chicago, or also known as the Taylor prison. And this describes Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem when Hezekiah was king. And there's a 6-sided prism, is what it is, and written on behalf of Sennacherib, who was king of Assyria, and contains narratives of 8 of his battles. And one of them is one with King Hezekiah, which is described specifically in 2 Kings 19. And that's also quite fascinating. There are also other things, such as the Lachish letters, which refer to Nebuchadnezzar's invasion of Judah and illustrate the life and times of Jeremiah the prophet. We also have specific things concerning the book of Daniel, such as the Nabonidus Chronicle, which is dated from about 555 to 540 BC. And this is interesting because you see, until the 19th century, the knowledge of Babylonia and Assyria was based really on the Old Testament and a few Greek writers. And not until the discovery of these kinds of documents and resources that we have now discovered and deciphered the cuneiform scripts and the languages written in this script. That's when we began to see what was going on, and we learned a great deal. There was, in fact, for example, the Hittites, which are mentioned, you might recall, among the people who inhabited the land. There was a claim that such a people never existed. Now, ironically, you can learn Hittite. You know, enough has been found if you want to really do that, but it's available. A lot of ites who were there, you know, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amalekites, the Phleboites, the electric lights, you know, and so forth. But at any rate, there are a lot of ites. But you also have the Babylonian Chronicle, which tells of King Jehoiakim and Nebuchadnezzar. And these sorts of things I find are very fascinating, because one of the objections that you probably will have heard of is that when Belshazzar is mentioned in Daniel 5, the objection had been made that we know that actually it was Nabonidus who was the king at that particular time, and so Daniel must be in error. It turns out then that actually the Nabonidus Chronicle actually shows that he was indeed king of Babylon, but the fact is that we now know that there were two kings of Babylon. There was a co-regency, and this was often done, a father and a son. And the father, Nabonidus, installed his son Belshazzar as a co-regent because he was spending much of his time, about 10 years away from Babylon itself, warring against various countries. And so when the Persians conquered the city in 539 BC, Belshazzar was killed. And you recall that then Nabonidus was later captured and they was sent to exile. That would, by the way, explain something we couldn't figure out before. Why on earth would he offer Daniel the third place in the kingdom? Turned out the first two were taken. We just didn't know it. In other words, our knowledge of the ancient world was not understood until this very recent discovery of these chronicles. And so I'm suggesting here that these are actually illuminating our knowledge of the Old Testament in profound ways. The well-known Cyrus cylinder also is important because of the way it describes details about the King Cyrus and what was going on at that time. And I think these are all important things for us to see. We have the Cyrus decree granting permission to the Jews to rebuild their temple. That's mentioned specifically in the Cyrus cylinder. As for the New Testament, a great deal of archaeological support. We have abundant references in the New Testament, as you know, to things like the Pool of Bethesda and Jacob's Well in Bethlehem, Nazareth. Other places, residences of Pilate in Jerusalem, the Gabbatha, the pavement, all these things are mentioned specifically, and indeed these have been actually explored and excavations have been done. Now you can actually see, for example, the pavement. And it's found way under the city, the level of the current city of Jerusalem. And you go down there, and it's really eerie to be there because you can actually see on those stones, which were at one time by the Antonia fortress, they were exposed, they were outside, and you can see carved in them some of the games that the Roman soldiers would play. And so it's right where Jesus was and where they were actually doing this very sort of thing, gambling and so forth, you see. And so you actually can see this thing. And these things are fascinating because they not only make history come alive, but they give you a feel for the reliability and indeed falsifiability of the scriptures. And I think this is a very important issue. Luke is another example. There are many critical attacks that have been reversed, and one of those was Luke as a historian because he made a number of things such as his reference to Lysanias as the so-called tetrarch of Abilene. I can't help but think of Abilene in the Old West. You know, I'm sorry, but the tetrarch, and it was actually assumed that couldn't be true. There was no such person, but archaeologists indeed have found two Greek inscriptions which show that Lysanias was indeed the tetrarch of Abilene in the years 14 to 29. And he uses various technical terms as well, like proconsul and procurator and asiarch and praetor and politarch. And all these are very specific kinds of terms that are actually apropos to the places and people that he discusses. So indeed, actually, Luke turns out to be a very reliable historian in that respect. And so this, again, gives us a greater confidence. And my conclusion concerning this is that it really is unprecedented and unparalleled in passing these three tests, the bibliographic, the internal, and the external tests, in comparison with other ancient books. And that most professional archaeologists and historians really, I find what's interesting, are more likely to acknowledge the historicity of the Bible than many theologians. Many theologians still embrace pre-archaeological critical theories about the Bible. And I think there's more going on to it here that we might suppose. I think the evidence strongly supports the accuracy of the Bible in relation to history and culture, but in many cases it's overlooked or rejected because it may, in fact, go against philosophical presuppositions. I can assure you that if the New Testament documents did not refer to the whole issue of one's eternal destiny, of the issue of God and of salvation and Jesus Christ and so forth, if indeed it was not based upon those things or referring to those things, it would receive a much wider readership and acceptance, let's say, than if it deals with those things. See, what I believe is going on here is often that there is a hard line objection based upon the reality that the Scriptures teach that people are at enmity with God, and that there is indeed a hardwired in human nature. A biblical anthropology gives us a very clear and I believe realistic view of what human nature is about. And it shows that in our natural state we are opposed to the authority and to the rule of God, and that there is more often than merely an intellectual objection, but there can be a moral, a spiritual objection. How many times have I had the experience where I've talked with somebody and I begin to see that they're throwing up smoke screens? And they're just throwing them up because they don't want to deal with these issues. And I have actually told them, you know, if I could somehow prove to you that Jesus really did rise from the dead, and if you could accept that as so, would you then bow the knee and receive him? And they say no. At that juncture, I know now I'm not dealing with a matter of history, a matter of fact, but a matter of the heart. And it really always comes down to this. It's not merely information. There's much more to it than that. The way to God is actually through the way of the surrendered will. And that requires the power and grace of the Spirit of God to break through and that natural blindness. Because as the Scriptures teach, we are in our natural state blinded in this regard. So I should not be surprised if there in fact is a tremendous warfare vis-a-vis these kinds of claims. What I find exciting, however, is that as time goes by, the evidence, I believe, will continue to grow in support. But what I love to see, it's fascinating, I love it and hate it at the same time, is how people just jump on things like the Gospel of Judas. They just right away, all these crazy inflated paper, these headlines, idiotic headlines, totally irresponsible, none of which really turned out to be the case. Or this whole idea, we found Jesus' tomb, the family tomb and so forth. All these things turn out, upon further examination, not to be what they're claiming them to be, but people certainly love them because it sells. And people also have a desire, in part, to be relieved by the notion that, see, this stuff isn't so after all. I think a lot of people would, and if you read Dinesh D'Souza's book, for example, What's So Great About Christianity, I like the fact that he has a concluding chapter in which he says at the end of the day, much of the new atheism is wired around the fact that it's a lot more convenient to believe that from the standpoint of one's own moral life. And so there is this factor as well. In other words, we're not dealing merely with an objective thing. There's an objective dimension of truth, I believe. And I think that God has clearly revealed himself in space-time history and has not left himself without witness. In fact, I think that evidence continues to grow. At the same time, however, there's still going to be the capacity that people have to turn away from that. Before I quit, I want to make a couple of extra statements. I believe that God has apportioned the evidence in such a way that there is always enough evidence to satisfy the heart and mind of a person who would receive the truth, but also just enough ambiguity to justify a person's rejection of the truth. And I believe he does this precisely because he so treasures our capacity as people in the image of God to make true decisions and moral decisions that are not coerced. What I find interesting, though, as skepticism increases, so does the evidence, so that he continues to keep up that balance. I do a thing, I have a new presentation I've been working on science, faith, and reason. In fact, I'm going to be trying it out, the visual version of for the first time at the National Conference in Christian Apologetics next month in Charlotte. And what I'm approaching is my strategy is to use incontrovertible features of the world, such in this case with the sciences. For example, that the universe has a beginning. that matter, energy, and space and time actually have a beginning, that they're contingent actualities and require something transcendent. Secondly, that there is the growing evidence for the fine-tuning and the incredible elegance of the universe, and this is only going to continue to increase. Number three, the reality of the complexity of the first cell, of any cell, and the yawning gap of the attempts to come up with an explanation for that, and the elegance of vis-a-vis biogenesis, the origin of the first cell. And the fourth one I use is information theory, and I deal specifically with the nature of language and information in the genetic code. And that's all fun. There's a lot of other features of the world, but those four are kind of fun to talk about. And what I find is fun about it is this: I can assure you, as time goes by, that as skepticism increases, God bumps up the ante of the evidence and still makes it so that we can have a satisfied mind. For example, this is not related to this topic, but it popped into my mind, and sometimes I have to give you a little bit of a stream of consciousness here. And in this, I'm thinking about the fact that the claim has been made not many years ago, and still many claim, that since it turns out that approximately 98% of the human genome consists of DNA that does not code for genes, therefore, the rest must be junk DNA, which is fascinating to me. Consider the arrogance. If we don't know what it does, it must be junk. It's a phenomenal notion. How about a little humility here is what the limitations of science. If anything, you should be aware that the more we learn about anything in the natural world, whatever you want it to be, the more mysterious, elegant, and complex it becomes, not the less. I can predict, and I predicted the first time I heard that that's not going to be true. That in fact we will discover actual reason for that form of DNA, that 98% has a purpose. It's now been demonstrated, and with increasing clarity, that that's actually an operating system that guides the actual gene expression from the other portions of the DNA, and that there is another more hierarchy of operating systems, one above that that guides that operating system. If anything, it's getting more elegant, not less. And the deficient attempts to refute this are becoming more anemic. They're becoming less and less satisfying. But what's interesting is the weight of the evidence continues, and this is ironic. With greater capacity and technological prowess, we're beginning to see more and more evidences for the Creator all around us, even though skepticism increases. This is why I believe the new atheism is more and more shrill. Shrill because the evidence is systematically moving away from them. As to fine-tuning, I can predict with tremendous confidence that every year more fine-tuning parameters will be discovered. Indeed, they are. In the time when Sagan wrote his book Contact, there were only a couple of these that were known. Now there are over 600 of them, and growing. Fine-tuning parameters. I won't go any further than that. Let me see. That's my conclusion. A double standard. And so I would say, by the way, this is just another little thought before we go and finish this. A word about the fact that if we can show at least that Scripture, without claiming inspiration, this is very important. My approach is merely to say, are these in fact credible primary historical documents, these individual documents? Because if we can show that they are reasonable, that provides a fine case for the resurrection of Christ, because of what we can deal with that, because actually attempts to explain away the resurrection of Christ, given this reality, become actually more implausible than that he really rose from the dead. They take a good deal more faith to believe. And ultimately, the resurrection of Jesus, by the way, would then point to the divine authority of Scripture. Why? Because Jesus bears witness to it, and if he indeed rose from the dead, then what he says about the Scriptures probably has a little bit of weight. You see the logic here. So I'm not starting with inspiration to support inspiration. I'm simply starting with this as reliable documents, then showing that it would then point to the resurrection of Christ, which then moves us to a conclusion about what our Lord said. So if that makes sense. I think I'm going to stop there.